Welcome back for our second session of the Policy for the People Technology Summit. I'm Nicole Austin Hillary, and I have the pleasure and privilege of serving as the president and CEO of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. If you missed our earlier session, and this is your first time joining us today, I'm sad to say you missed a great first session, but do not fear, it will be available to you to view on demand following today's summit. The digital divide refers to the gap that exists between demographics and regions that have access to modern information and communications technology and those that simply do not. Though the term now encompasses the technical and financial ability to utilize available technology, along with access or the lack of access to the internet, the gap actually refers to the constantly shifting development of technology. The gap and the divide exist every way we can identify, on the side of creation, education, entrepreneurship, business, and innovation. Our community presently exists as consumers, but lacks the same equity and income access as our counterparts. This is a significant problem. The consequences of the digital divide include mental health, education barriers, entertainment, and even our criminal justice system. We simply cannot stand by and watch this divide widen even further, nor can we remain silent. In the context of a growing affluence gap in the United States, increasing the opportunities for people of color in one of America's highest paced and fast-growing industry sectors would be transformative for our community, and it would be a huge step forward in widening the circle of inclusive growth. As we always look back at the successes of the ones that came before us, one of the things that we remember to carry forward is a community mindset, that it is about not one person achieving, it is about the collective achieving and having access. So in this session of our Policy Summit, our panelists will discuss the current digital landscape and the growth opportunities that exist in African technology and energy sectors, and how U.S. Black American communities can partner with diasporic initiatives. We are elated to have representatives here with us this afternoon who can share and speak to lasting relationships, partnerships, and impactful opportunities for all of us to take advantage of. Now, please allow me the privilege of reintroducing the chairwoman of the Congressional Black Caucus, Congresswoman Joyce Beatty, who represents Ohio's 3rd Congressional District. Welcome again, Congresswoman Beatty.
Hello, everyone. I'm Congresswoman Joyce Beatty, Chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, and it is my pleasure to join the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation to welcome you to the 2022 Policy for the People Technology Equity Summit, where we gather today to host vital conversations. These are not ideal conversations, nor for the sake of pastime or parade. These conversations are for the purpose of heightened awareness and raising our consciousness to the most accurate truth. For we know that truth and awareness are the seeds of solid policy. As we continue to push forward, demanding every right deserved, we lift our voices and demand that our rights be accessible, exercised, and counted. Our rights are justified on every playing field, including digitally, especially in this digital age where so much of our lives are lived under, with, and over digital platforms. Today, what computer scientists call algorithmic bias affects what our community sees, has access to, and gets denied from. We need conversations like the ones we will hold today. We must always make ourselves intently aware of the policies, practices, and protocols that inform our everyday lives. Then we can become stronger influencers and leaders of our community. We're on the heels of such a gloriously inspiring and power-driven event, the annual Legislative Conference. We must use this momentum to drive forward. There is never a better time for any vital conversation than the present. Thank you and enjoy the summit.
Thank you, Representative Beatty and the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation for the opportunity to have this vital discussion. My name is Jared Lewis, and it is my pleasure to moderate this session on the digital age and strategic opportunities for Africa. As a Black American member of the global diaspora who visits the continent frequently and has worked at the intersection of technology access and equity, I know this is a vital conversation for the future of the continent and collective global community. You know, in the United States, we often frame technology access in terms of the digital divide, categorized in three subject areas: digital infrastructure, digital access, and digital adoption. I think for today, we should similarly categorize our discussion into these areas as we dive into the discussion on digital access and the divide on the African continent. But first, let me welcome our distinguished panelists who represent a diverse range of expertise and experiences ranging from economics, law and development, investments in startups, and public policy. First, Landry Signe is the executive director and professor at the Thunderbird School of Global Management, senior fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution, distinguished fellow at Stanford University, chairman of the Global Network for African Prosperity, and senior advisor to many top global leaders. Thank you and welcome. Next, Mihret Woldesmait is a previous associate at White & Cass LLP and a member of the firm's energy infrastructure project and asset finance practice. During her time at White & Cass, she worked on a subsea fiber optics cable project and various other projects in Africa and other emerging markets. Thank you and welcome. Next, we have Christopher Koya, who is a Congressional Energy Fellow at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, bringing experience from working with the U.S. Department of Energy, the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission, as well as nearly a decade spent residing in Nigeria. Mr. Koya is an economist and public policy practitioner who is passionate about making the policy process more accessible and understandable for vulnerable and underserved communities. Welcome. And finally, we welcome Ikechi Nwabulsi, former VC, wealth manager, and ex-NFLer, over 5 years building social apps, blockchain, and in 2018, Ikechi founded Tribal. He's a recognized leader with publications in Black Enterprise, Yahoo Finance, and Afrotech. He's an active member in the crypto communities, Black NFT Art, Black Bitcoin Billionaires, and many more. Welcome and thank you. As I said before, in the US, we speak about digital access in terms of the digital divide. I want to start by asking our panelists who represent a range of diverse expertise, what is the digital divide and how is it different on the continent and similar than how we view the digital divide in the United States?
So let me get started. So many factors are important when we speak about the digital divide. So to what extent are we including the wealthy versus the poor, rural area versus urban regions, gender questions, women versus male. So that gap between demographics, areas, the one that have access to those modern technology versus not. But beyond access, we also have the question of effective usage of those technology, productive usage of those technology to grow the economy. And when speaking about the rural divide, many will be mostly thinking about the differences between Africa and the rest of the world. But it is also important to note the variation also within the continent. So, for example, even in Africa, you will have countries such as Morocco, with more than 84% of people having access to internet, or Seychelles 79%, Egypt 71%, compared to other countries that you can also have, such as the Central African Republic, only 7.1% of people will have access to internet, or Eritrea, 8%, and the Comoros, 8.5%. So it's important when you think about the question of digital divide to think about it from a holistic perspective, to think about the variation within country, between countries, within region, within cities, gender question, but also the people are able versus disabled, able bodies versus disabled people. That those are also important dynamics to take into consideration. And if I refer to the International Telecommunication Union statistics, so looking at a couple of trends, one of the trends at the global level, so you will see variation between, for example, the growth between 2017 and 2020 of the fixed broadband versus mobile broadband, but also the rural household internet access globally is only at 37% compared to the urban household internet access, which is at 72%. So those dynamics are really important because they are also the drivers of inequality. And when you think about inclusion, we want to be certain that those dimensions are taken into consideration. I have spent some time in Alaska as well. So when you think about the digital divide, sometimes we overlook that some regions within the United States are lagging compared to other. The variation between core important cities such as New York and others such as Anchorage in Alaska, or within Alaska, the variation between the Anchorage itself and the remote villages. So those are the questions that I would really want us to think about, not just access, but also effective usage, productive usage for broader and inclusive development.
Thank you, Landry. So thinking about demographics, gender, ableism, wealth, use, how people use, and how it varies depending on geography. That's really helpful. It's a good framework. Are there any other thoughts as it relates to what the digital divide means and how it's similar or different to how we think about it in the United States?
Yes, if I could jump in here as well. I think one of the definitely agree with everything that was said previously, and just want to add that another one of the divides that's interesting in Africa is the divide between the coastal countries versus the landlocked countries. Especially if you're thinking about coastal countries like South Africa and Namibia, that are connected by subsea cable, fiber optic cables, through the Google Equinor subsea cable project. And then on the East Coast, you have the Two Africa cable system, right, connecting the East African countries, Kenya, to Europe and Asia. And so these countries would tend to have a little bit more connection to fiber optics when you compare them to more landlocked countries like Central Africa, as we mentioned. Eritrea is not really landlocked, but yes, those countries, Ethiopia, those kind of countries that tend to have less of connection because they don't have access to these subsea cables that are now very dominant in Africa, that are more coastal based as well.
Actually, so infrastructure seems to vary depending on where you are on the continent, for sure. What are some of the drivers of those differences?
Well, if I could hop in, I think some of the drivers of the differences, obviously, we mentioned infrastructure, but then it's from the policy landscape that we're looking at. Some of these nations are more progressive in terms of their policy overall, in terms of how they approach their economy, just specifically on the tech side, that they see that that's an avenue for development. Not only economically, but for their, human capital development. But then other nations, you can see that it's not as much of a priority. And I mentioned countries like Nigeria that, recently they had a ban over certain social media platforms, which then had economic, effects that, people have their, businesses online and things like this and use that platform. So a lot of it is also, the policy environment of these different nations and how they approach it, which partners they take up, which partners they refuse to take up, how eager they are to engage in these partnerships or not, and things like that.
That's really helpful. I would love to switch to another topic under access. Christopher, you mentioned Nigeria. Lagos, Nigeria, Cape Town, Johannesburg, South Africa, Nairobi, Kenya, Cairo. These are all major growing technology hubs on the continent. I'm wondering, Ikechi, if you could speak a little bit to, speak to some of these successes that we're seeing in these countries, maybe why some of these countries are maybe more successful than others. I mean, what's really driving that?
Yeah, no problem. I think what we've seen is Africa, from a technological perspective, has really had the opportunity to enter into the market, especially through their mobile devices first. And with so many people in the region actually essentially discovering the internet through their mobile device, it's introduced a new series of solutions to attack certain problems in the region. And I think what Africa has really latched onto, especially, is the adoption of fintech technologies used to open up commerce, not only locally, but internationally. So you see amazing technology companies that are scaling, like Chipper Cash, helping merchants collect payments via virtual debit cards and send remittances internationally. Flutterwave doing something very similar, kind of positioning themselves kind of as the Stripe for Africa. And overall, numerous new companies that are coming that are aiming to integrate social media and digital wallets in a way to unlock experiences that you've seen in China through technologies like WeChat and the like.
Now, that's really interesting. It sounds like fintech and the finance sector is a major driver. Have any of you noticed any other industries that are driving technological innovation and adoption on the continent?
I mean, I think what is that saying? Like, need breeds innovation. And there's a lot of need, obviously, in Africa. So, I mean, I think one of, the interesting ones that I've seen is obviously agri-tech is really big right now because of the climate change and desertification, especially in countries like Egypt. That's a really big thing right now. We also, this is specifically really interesting to me, but in Ethiopia, there's a new drive for health tech. And so we're really seeing how do you provide information through apps. So one of the ones I can mention is Yene Health. It's an app that allows mothers to be able to be provided maternal information through an app. And I think that's really interesting because if you look at what we talked about in terms of access divide, there's also a big divide in health care access between rural and urban areas. And so if you're able to kind of bridge that digital divide between rural and urban, then you can also bridge these other divides, right? You can provide healthcare information through these apps. You can provide education through technology. And so I think there's a lot of interesting things happening, but those are the two that come to mind for me.
Wow.
So I totally agree with everything which was said, and probably I released a report also on how to use emerging technology, the fourth industrial revolution technology, in the context to address healthcare challenges on the continent. And for example, in terms of artificial intelligence, we'll have initiative or companies such as Care AI, computer platform supported by blockchain technology using integrated sensor for autonomous patient monitoring. You have Sophia, which is also regional cloud-based platform accelerating collaboration between numerous healthcare facilities, among others. In terms of digital health, mobile health, and e-health, you have companies such as Hello Doctor from South Africa, mobile app providing 24/7 communication with a doctor. You will also have MPG in Ghana, for example, platform using cloud-based and mobile technologies to verify pharmaceutical authenticity. So again, here you have it with drones. We don't present anymore Zipline, although it was a company which was created in California. However, it is in Rwanda that they have first operated for use drone for delivery in rural healthcare facilities, given the agile governance before expanding globally now. So thinking about the Internet of Things, we'll have to think about the cardiopad in Cameroon and many other technologies that we can share. So again, we have a vibrant environment and innovations. The challenge is really to scale up those innovation at the continental or at the global level.
Landry, you're speaking about a really important issue, and I think both you and Mihret both touched on it. Someone has, for example, been going to the doctor or having deliveries one way for 20 or 30 years. What is the reaction to these innovations and these new ways of engaging with healthcare providers or being able to engage with goods and services? Are there generational differences? What are some of the challenges, but also opportunities in really supporting that adoption?
People are incredibly enthusiastic about those innovations. And you know why? It is because they are actually solving some of the most pressing challenges that they are facing. Let's speak about mobile money. In remote rural area, now it is possible for grandmother, grandfather to have transaction with your son or daughters based in different cities, sometimes based in different countries. Only M-Pesa study has shown recently that M-Pesa has had an impact of addressing or reducing extreme poverty by 2% in Kenya. So that is an administration of financial service. You also have the one for healthcare. Of course, depending on the region, you will have a period of adaptation, a period of discovery. But because those technology are solving some of the critical challenges, I think they are incredibly welcome. Now, when we speak about some of the other area in agriculture, for example, especially when applied at the industrial level or for mining, resolute mining, especially when applied at the industrial level, we also have some concern by citizens who feel like they may lose their jobs if everything is automatized. So those are some of the questions that we may have, depending on the type of technology. But the technology oriented to people providing specific solutions to individual citizens, I think are the ones which are incredibly welcome.
If I could add to that, I think I would also say because Africa is such a young population, I mean, the average age is below 30. So adapting to digital solutions, it just comes easier when you're younger. But also because, when you're talking about exactly mobile banking, when you're in rural areas, you're not going from, the typical norm being going to a bank, because usually there are no banks. When I served in the Peace Corps in Namibia, there was no bank in the rural area I lived in. We transacted purely through mobile banking. And so when you haven't had, the normal institutions that we see, it's very easy to just not even miss them, because all is I hadn't, barely, cash being sent to me through Western Union or something, to now I get it on my phone. And so it's very easy, I guess, to leapfrog because you just haven't had those kind of institutions in those areas.
For sure. Actually, adding to that, I think it's a great point you're bringing up the youth that comes with the continent. I think the average age in Nigeria might be below 18. I think. Don't quote me on that. But with that, it's all about building for the future. And to your point, mobile first, mobile wallets, even entrepreneurship and new businesses that are going to be created are going to be driven by what these teenagers and young adults are able to do on their phones. And so really excited to see what the future has and hope that policies can be adaptive enough to not block innovation in ways I think we've already begun to do, especially in Nigeria or markets that are banning crypto as an example. It's just the inevitable future that we're going to.
You raise a really good point, and I'd love to circle back to Christopher here. When we think about the average age being maybe on the younger side of the spectrum, we compare that to sort of the average age of the decision maker. And we talked about, you mentioned earlier policymakers and their role in really incentivizing and growing adoption. Has there been a response in your experience and observation to sort of a younger generation from policymakers? How are policymakers working with the younger generation or not working with the younger generation? And therefore, what are the opportunities?
Well, in my experience, it's been more of the negative that, we have a very youthful, vibrant population that, they pick up on these tech trends and fintech and things like that. But from the policy perspective, it's a lot of, it's an older generation who are, fixed to, these, fixed brick and mortar financial institutions, transacting, through exchange, like regulated exchanges and things like that when it comes to cryptocurrency. So that's where there's, a lot of friction between the generational divide, but then that also bridges over into the policy that, at the base level, sometimes it's just that these policymakers just don't really understand, what these technologies are, the opportunities that they present, how they're being utilized, how they can be utilized in the future if we continue to develop them. So that's, a real big gap that we, tend to see, particularly in, nations like Nigeria, when you look at things like cryptocurrency that, as opposed to, trying to put in a framework to, foster the utilization of cryptocurrency, you saw, policies that tried to regulate, cryptocurrency such that the only cryptocurrency that could be operated would be a government operated, cryptocurrency, which, wasn't the most effective way of going about it because it didn't have, the same name brand that you get with, Bitcoin and things like that. So it's still a bit of, a gap between what the policymakers are doing, what they think of these things, and then the, generations that are really utilizing them and have the potential to expand these technologies further.
Very valuable. I think, Christopher, you're hitting on a subtopic of adoption, which is literacy. What is the landscape around digital literacy throughout the continent? What are some efforts that folks have seen to support literacy, or what are some of the opportunities for, expanding digital literacy throughout the continent?
I think that's a really huge thing because as recently as yesterday, the Central Bank of Nigeria brought out that they're going to be redesigning some of the Naira notes to improve circulation of money and things like that, which is great in terms of the digital economy because lots of people, have these transactions. But then when you look at, the local economies, like people that, go and buy their daily goods, that, public transportation and things like that, these are places where the digital, economy hasn't really come to. So then, it's a very tight timeline that this is being introduced. The new notes are going to be introduced on the 15th of December. But then current, notes in circulation are no longer going to be legal tender by the 31st of January of next year. That's a very tight timeline that, you have, these are kinds of things that you have to put into that, policy realm that, okay, what are we going to do to improve literacy so that people just know even about fiscal currency that's in place, not to talk about, how this is how you can adopt, digital currencies, put your businesses online such that these kinds of changes in policy won't have such a drastic effect on your business model. Because you're talking about people that, they might have a mobile phone, but, some of these transactions, as much as you have a mobile phone, just because of the state of, the economy and the culture, that, you're not going to have, digital currencies and things like that. So this big change is something that, this is an opportunity to start, implementing these things, getting this literacy, this education, putting these trainings out, letting people know that, hey, these are the opportunities that you can have, that you can get rid of this and then, improve your businesses and things like that.
Building on this, I think it is important when we think about emerging technologies or we think about the fourth industrial revolution, people often think about the technology aspect. But the impact on society is holistic. So there are some characteristics that I just want to highlight. So the first is the velocity. Innovation are coming with an incredible speed. The second is the scope. all the sector are affected to an extent or another. So even the less affected sector, the one left relatively left behind, are also subject to the consequences of the progress. And then we have the system impact. So they affect the way people are governed, they affect productivity, and they affect different other dimensions. So that those are some of the points that I want to highlight. And if you allow me, in a recent publication that we also released with the Brookings Institution, we're exploring the impact of emerging technologies on the fourth industrial revolution on various sectors, the service sector through e-commerce, expanded tourism, represent probably one of the greatest opportunity for formal wage employment expansion, increasing revenue, but also the quality of job, as long as energy and ICT is also available. In the agricultural sector, we have a potential, especially for farm, to increase earnings, but also to reduce poverty. So we have that broader impact. In manufacturing, the new technology also open new opportunity for smaller scale production for domestic and regional markets, although more investment will be needed there. But you also have the substitution of capital for labor. So which are related to those questions are related to the inclusion and ability to eventually reduce the number of work in some of the areas. So I just want to bring this back to the attention that when we speak about technology, so it is not just about the technology per se, but how the life of people could be affected, either the everyday life, the economic opportunities, and the broader economic transformation of the continent, of a village, of a city.
Absolutely. I'd love to bring Mihret and Ikechi back into the fold here, because you both have actually uniquely worked in emerging markets. And so you've seen and worked firsthand in a space where a new technology is being introduced. It's having this external effect on broader society, but there's still a need to create techniques that engage the population, that adopt, that allow for folks to be educated on the topic. What are some of the things that you've seen to be effective, or how have you approached that work in some of your past work lives?
Yeah, happy to jump in.
Yeah.
So a couple things, I guess, had the opportunity to watch my family do business throughout Nigeria for many years before I ever entered the market. Hired my engineering team straight out of Nigeria, so I've always worked directly with people there on the continent. And the biggest thing is, when we talk about digital divides, more broadly, there's still a communication divide as well. I think it's taken for granted, depending on the industry that you're in. Your industry has its own set of languages and set of frameworks that people usually speak within. And so there's a middle ground that has to be met on both sides, just to properly communicate information, set goals, and get alignment on how long a goal will take to meet. If you're going to do business in an emerging market, then you must have patience and ultimately know that whatever framework you think that you're going to build something in, it's probably going to take extensively longer. And everyone on both sides of that fence are really still learning, in a very much so learning phase, in a scaling phase when it comes to building various infrastructure in that area. And so that's my short snippet for my experience there, and happy to pass the mic.
Yes, and to add to that, because all Ike said is very true. And when I was in the Peace Corps, this isn't a very innovative project that I did, but I was simply trying to bring a computer lab to my rural area. And just like he said, you need local support. And in Africa, that's not just your local city councilman. I had to get support from the chief. You have to get support then from the councilman, because those two entities might not see eye to eye on everything. And so the complexities of which stakeholders you have to bring together in order to roll out any project, let alone a technological project that might disrupt how things are done, who will benefit. It is really layered in Africa, right? And then there was a battle between whether this will be used by the community versus the vocational skills students who are coming from different parts of the country. Who's going to pay for the internet? Is it going to be the government? So there's a lot more complexities when you're rolling out a project. And I think that, and this was, like I said, for a simple project, like bringing a computers and setting up a computer lab, but definitely, and the policy, right? Like you need policy support. Are you going to get funding from the government? And to take it back, one of the reasons why you have certain countries that are a lot more successful, like Kenya, for example, is because they have invested not only in policy and making sure that it is easy to do technological businesses or to do startups and to innovate by making the business licensing registration process simple, but they've also invested in ICT infrastructure, putting up fiber optics, putting up broadband connections. And so you really do need, it takes a whole village. It takes a whole community to roll out these projects. And that's been my experience on the ground.
Yeah, Mihret, you got into, I think, the next area of discussion, and you dived into it so well. There are a range of historic and cultural authorities throughout the continent, and they vary based on their histories and based on a range of dynamics that may be quite literally and metaphorically foreign to Western thoughts or Western actors. I wanted to know if we could speak to some of those cultural differences, which I think you started that dialogue, and what is the responsibility of international partners in engaging with these authorities, whether they be tribal, regional, state, and their historical legacies. And I'll toss it over to anyone who wants to take it.
I guess, could you repeat? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's a really big issue, and how to address that is complicated. But in my field, like within the energy space, is something that you see in terms of even developing technologies and things like that. That like it's not what the technology is necessarily. You can have a great technology, but it's about the community buy-in. The community needs to understand what you're actually bringing to them, what their benefit is, and then what they need to contribute to the success of this, if there is any contribution that they need to make on their own. So that, I mean, when it comes to those aspects of it, it really becomes how well you go about building relationships at the most basic level. That being able to interact with the people, understand what their needs truly are, and how you can go meet in the middle to try and mitigate what those needs are, which might be completely different from whatever your project is. You might come in with a health project, but you have to build a market for these people because they don't have a central place to trade their goods and things like that. So when it comes to that, some of it is going to be taking that step to really develop relationships, understand people, cultures, just how they operate and things like that. And then also taking that step that's outside your business model, but that you probably have to define as goodwill, to make sure that you're actually providing real benefits beyond what your project is to these communities, such that they also buy into what you're bringing to them.
Landry, have you seen any in your research, any case studies of best practices where organizations have been really effective at doing that?
So there are many dimensions which are really important, and I think the local buying is not the biggest challenges. And I think I have highlighted that before, especially for individual technologies, because when, for example, people will be using drone to deliver medication in remote villages, like those remote villages will not be opposed to receive medication. So when M-Pesa will be expanding in rural areas, and allow financial transaction, local people will not be opposed to those type of innovations. So we can sometimes see challenges, perhaps when they are innovation. I mentioned resolute mining, for example, which was adopted in Mali, and I think it was one of the world most, let's say, automatized like mining for gold. And so that those are the type of innovations where we can sometimes see the resistance of citizens because they feel like they are the jobs which are saved by using the technology could have been created otherwise. And let me use this as a transition to a couple of dimensions. You were mentioning so how to get the buying and the role of international players. I think that one of the challenges that we often see is really first starting with the challenge, the poor, let's say, legal environment, regulatory quality, taxation system, which are in fact preventing the adoption and the acceleration of some of those technology that we discussed before. But also the challenges related to infrastructure, whether physical or digital infrastructure, and which often require a mix of both public and private investment and a lot of transparency. The one also related to the skills, and I think many of the distinguished panelists have also mentioned that. So to what extent can we reduce that skill deficits at all levels, starting at the primary education level? Because when we think about digital skills, many people think about engineer, but we need the fluency at the very beginning when people are still
Hello,
very
my name is
young.
Ikechi.
So those are some of the how some of those challenges could potentially be addressed, and how could African government working with civil society and international actor be able to do it. So one of the things is to really develop a strategy which should be a whole of government approach with all the ministries involved. So no single ministry should have the task of ensuring inclusive the inclusion of emerging technology or the fourth industrial revolution, because this require infrastructure, finance, cyber security, employment, youth education. So it's a very complex issue, and they should really maximize growth. Yeah, maximize growth and transformation in our end there by really stimulating the adoption of those technology by providing a conducive environment, a conducive business environment, but also financial incentive for the private sector for successful deployment. I'll pause there.
Well, it sounds very similar to what Ikechi was saying earlier, is that there is a communication problem at the base of all of this. And in order to really bring people along, we've got to figure out how to translate this to the languages that people understand, both culturally, but also intellectually, where they work, how they play, et cetera. That being said, let's bring it back to policy. What is the role of international governments or international actors and companies to support that? So it sounds like what you were saying is a whole of government approach on the continent and within the countries on the continent. What role should we play? What role should Congress play? What role should the International Monetary Fund play in supporting this?
Please go ahead. I will go later.
Okay. I was just going to say, I think that there are, the World Bank has just released, or recently in 2020, released a study that said that you will need for digital transformation in Africa, you need about $100 billion. And because mainly for infrastructure, for good quality internet, broadband connection, for 4G, 5G connections, for fiber optics. And obviously, yes, some of that can come from within Africa, but a lot of that has to come from outside of Africa. And I think that, to kind of add on to what Professor Landry was saying, you really do need policy that is very clear for international investors to understand in all of Africa, right? The idea of getting a policy that's uniform across Africa is a dream. But even within specific countries, you just have to have really clear investment policies. You have to have really clear licensing, intellectual property, copyright, trademark, all those laws that are really important for investors to understand, because nobody wants to put their money into something and they don't know if they're secured legally from a legal framework. And that's why you see countries like South Africa, Kenya, who have a little bit more, Egypt, who have a little bit more of a more mature legal system, or a policy that's been well thought out, and has been, like the professor mentioned, has involved multiple ministries. So you don't go to the Ministry of Finance and they tell you something, and you go to the Ministry of whatever and they tell you a different thing. So I think that their knowledge transfer is really important in terms of how do we make these policies work. And when I say knowledge transfer, I don't mean just one way, right? Like I don't mean just the US or Europe tells African countries this is what your legal policy should be on copyright or intellectual property, but also we have a lot to learn from other African countries. How did South Africa do it? How did Kenya do it? And if international investors or international actors can say, okay, this can be a more reciprocal knowledge transfer. I think that would go a long way in helping countries get a more efficient legal framework and policy framework.
And I couldn't agree more. As a matter of fact, in a piece that I did write and co-author with Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield, who is now representative of the United States to the United Nations. So the title was so related to the movie Wakanda. So the title was From Wakanda to Reality, Building Mutual Prosperity Between African Americans and Africa. And you can find it online, but one of the dimension which was discussed where African American can also play a prominent role in unlocking this potential is the knowledge and technology sharing and advancement of US Africa relation. So we have an incredibly vibrant African American community here, of course, and around the world, which many of them are leading those innovation, those technologies among other in various areas. So the exchange of knowledge, of wealth, of technology can go both way to equally benefit both Africans and African Americans and Americans in general. So that collaboration could be really important. And globally, it's important also to, as was mentioned before, to reduce the cost of technology transfer. So this is one of the challenges with intellectual property, the indirect cost for doing business, and to massively invest. So only infrastructure, the gap in infrastructure on the continent is about $100 billion per year. And this is even an understatement, because if you have to think about infrastructure the same way we have infrastructure in the US, we'll probably be speaking about trillions of dollars. And energy, only for energy, more than 500 million of people in Africa do not have access to energy. And how can you have access to internet, quality internet, productive internet, or productive technology if you don't even have access to energy or to electricity? So I think those are the questions that those are some of the areas that where the global community could help in general, but also in particular the incredibly vibrant African American community could also be supportive.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Professor. And I want to narrow in on a point that you just made. But more broadly, it sounds like what I'm hearing is, on one hand, we need massive infrastructure investment, but then there's this social piece of it where we need to think about how to invest in dynamic relationships, education, cultural expansion. In the policy setting, we might refer to that as cultural exchange. And I think everyone here has an experience, an intimate experience in this cultural exchange. And I'm wondering if we can lean into that a bit more. How have you been influenced by having both an experience on the continent and maybe a more Western experience? And how has that influenced your work and led to some of the way that you're thinking about this topic?
Yeah, definitely. For me, like looking from the energy space, it's very similar in when you look at things like adoption of renewable energies and clean energy and things like that. Um, whether it's here in America or back home in Nigeria and things like that, there is a gap between, energy demand and energy production and things like that. And some of it, is just very base level that people need to get an understanding that, yes, these are the opportunities for energy. Yes, this is how you've been doing it. This is how we can, do it moving forward. And just, those bring it down to a simple level and translating policy to tangibles that people can understand in their, day-to-day lives, and how that, personally is of benefit to them, that it's not just an abstract concept of this is what the government's going to do, but, this is what happens when I bring this piece of, technology to your home in terms of a solar panel. If I put a solar panel on your house, like, oh, how do I get energy? It's affordable. I can control when I use the energy. So you can bring those tangible benefits down to that, individual level that people can understand and get that kind of, individual community regional buy-in.
That's wonderful. Any other thoughts? And Ikechi, I know that you've done, actually built products and services both here in the States and on the continent.
It's nothing major to add in. It's just it's definitely been a constant journey. I think those who have been thinking about people in emerging markets first for 5 years were ahead of the curve. Um, and it's going to be exciting to see what things continue to emerge and what kind of opportunities continue to present themselves as we kind of get into this new generation.
That's wonderful. Well, we're reaching the last bit of our discussion here, and I'd love to just do a round robin of all the wonderful panelists. What is the most immediate or important first step to universal digital access on the continent, and what can we do? What's the first step that we can take to help to achieve that? And we'll start. Why don't we start with Professor Landry?
So there are many dimensions which are extremely important. So I think that now when we think about technology, we should be thinking about inclusive digital transformation or inclusive technology, how to make sure that countries are not left behind. We see even on the continent, we have countries which have a high penetration and another one which is, and many other who are lagging. So how to make sure that women are not left behind, because male also dominate in those areas. How to make sure that rural areas are not left behind. So we see this in, I develop a framework where I have a few what I call various capitals. We have the infrastructure capital, how to ensure to have a sufficient level of infrastructure, physical or digital. So that should be one of the priority. A second priority will be the innovation and technology capital, how to ensure that we'll have actually those emerging technology adopted. The financing capital, how to make sure that you have the financial resources to fund those. The human capital, ultimately we are speaking about human, so how to make sure that the human dimension is considered across the board. And finally, agility, agile governance. As mentioned before, innovation is going at an incredible speed, and quite often government are lagging. So how to make sure that government will be involved in a way which, on one hand, unlock the innovation potential, but on the other hand, help or support that those innovations serve the greater good. And I will stop there.
Thank you. Mihret, would you like to jump in? What's what's a first step to ensuring universal access on the continent?
I will say, how do we make sure that when we need finance, and how do we make sure that this financing is not paternalistic or predatory? And I think that that's a big question for Africa. And I think especially with the diaspora and African Americans, how do we make sure that we're all taking care of each other, not only within the U.S. but the Black diaspora overall in the world, to make sure that we are getting good financing, and we own what we make.
Wonderful. And Ikechi, did you want to give a thought?
Yep. Yeah. So, one, I want to thank you guys again for all being here. Appreciate you all's time. Really.
Oh, looks like we lost Ikechi. Christopher, did you want to give our closing thought here? What's one step we can take to ensure universal access on the continent?
Yeah, for me, it comes down to just the holistic approach of human capital development, that everything that we are looking at in terms of technology, equity, and everything, it comes down to the human person, the individuals, and that we're looking at are we making people better? So we're looking at that from all aspects, that we want to improve access, but there's equity of access, that there's so many opportunities with these technologies. But then, when people have access to, 5G speeds and people have 2G speeds, you can say the opportunity is there, but they don't have the same level of access to those opportunities. So it's looking at human capital development from that, perspective of equity, that yes, there are these opportunities, but we want to make sure that everybody has access to these opportunities. Because the more people that we have that have access to these opportunities, the better developed, society that we have. We have a better trained workforce. We have more opportunities to develop these industries, these sectors, and things like that. So for me, it's just, looking at technology equity from the standpoint of human capital development.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate today's discussion. Very informative and multidimensional. So we've heard it here. In closing, there are three kind of first steps that we can take. One is to have an inclusive cultural approach. Two is to ensure that there is good, unrestricted, and non-predatory financing. And three is to ensure that we're investing in the whole human. And that came from this panel. And so we now know what our legislators ought to be doing to support universal adoption on the continent. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you all. In closing, we're going to pass it off to Desiree Solomon, who's the Research and Program Analyst at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, Jared. What a full and informational session on opportunities for tech innovation and economic development on the continent. Again, my name is Desiree Solomon, Research and Program Analyst at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. I'd like to extend a special thank you to Jared Lewis for expertly leading such an impactful discussion and underscoring the importance of community buy-in to create a more equitable future for our global Black community. I would like to thank each of our panelists for their time and expertise. To our audience, thank you all for joining session 2, and we invite you to attend session 3, Cooperative Technology Ecosystems that Drive Black Entrepreneurships, at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you to Chairwoman Beatty for her leadership, participation, and support. We'd like to thank our sponsors, TikTok and Google. We appreciate your partnership. Lastly, I want to leave our audience with 3 items. We want to hear from you, so please scan the QR code to complete a survey about today's event. Your insights help us to meet your needs for future events. Second, at the CBCF, our mission is to inform policy, educate the public, and develop leaders. At our Leadership Institute, we recruit, train, and provide opportunities for college students and recent graduates to work on the Hill and several other agencies. And we boast the largest pipeline placing Black leaders on the Hill. Applications are now open for fellowship and internship opportunities. Please visit our website to learn more about our Leadership Institute. Lastly, follow us on social media through Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram. It's an easy way to stay connected to the CBCF. Thank you all for joining us today. We hope to see you at our next session at 3 p.m. and again at our networking rooms at 4 p.m.